Welcome to CharityVillage Connects. As nonprofit leadership is increasingly under the microscope when it comes to public trust, transparency, and accountability, particularly in light of recent high-profile revelations about organizations such as Hockey Canada and We Charity, and as the sector grapples with a lack of diversity at the leadership level, we ask, is it time for a leadership refresh? Joining me to discuss these important issues is John Hallward, Chairman of Give3 and President of Sector 3 Insights. After a very successful career in the marketing research industry, John launched the charity Give3 to encourage greater giving and introduced Giving Tuesday and the Great Canadian Giving Challenge to the Canadian nonprofit sector, which has triggered tens of millions of additional donation dollars and other acts of giving in Canada. As president of Sector 3 Insights, John leads the social enterprise research firm to bring cutting-edge research tools from the corporate world to help the nonprofit sector succeed. John, welcome to CharityVillage Connects.
Thank you. My pleasure.
Well, let's sort of start with a check-in on the sector in terms of its leadership and governance. In light of some of the high-profile issues we've seen come up recently, including Hockey Canada and We Charity, can you talk about why the sector sees problems like this arise? How does it get to this point? Is it about transparency, regulation? What's behind this?
It may be just a numbers game with 85,000 charities and not a lot of great auditing. I mean, it's just, I think the CRA and the Charity Directorate doesn't have enough resources to be more vigilant of 85,000 charities. You're bound to get a few bad apples or people who stretch the moralities and the ethics of what the laws describe. And I think in particular, the two you named have got a lot of media coverage, which I guess is part of the equation, right? That these things get exposed so much. In part because they tie into the federal government, which makes good narrative on the news. So I think We Charity being known and famous got spread through the media very quickly. But it's just one, right? I mean, there's 99.9% of the other charities who just keep their head down and do a good job. So I guess it's a shame that a few get the negative headlines that they do.
Well, yes, we certainly know that most nonprofits and charities in the country are doing exceptional work and should not be tarnished by these high-profile cases. But these aren't small charities. These are huge organizations that are extremely well known. And if they exist at this scale, should we be concerned about how charities in general, smaller ones that don't have the oversight or the kind of, public scrutiny might be operating?
Yeah, should we have a concern? I would probably suggest no more than for private enterprise not paying their taxes or following questionable labor laws, et cetera. I would probably even think that the nonprofit sector is maybe above that, and that most of the leaders of these charities have great intentions and big hearts, and so they're really inclined to do good. Of course, in the for-profit sector, you have profit and you have taxes, and there's a real incentive to beat the system, if you will. There's not a lot of great incentive within the charitable system to beat the game. And then, as we appreciate, many boards in the nonprofit sector are staffed by volunteers who have no skin in the game either. So how willing and how hard and how empowered and how knowledgeable are they to follow best practices and proper governance, et cetera, all kind of allow some of this mischief to happen kind of under our noses.
Well, there have been multiple reports, including one from Environics and in the Canada Trust Index by Proof Strategies, have indicated there has been a sharp decline in public trust of charities over the past decade. Do you think it's because of these kind of scandals, or such as Hockey Night, or Hockey Canada, or We Charity, or is there other factors that are not immediately apparent that may be causing this?
Yeah, and I have three kind of millennial children, so I've come to hear from their perspective of this general distrust for anything that's old traditional organization, the old mechanisms of for-profit, lack of transparency, questionable marketing, questionable environmental practices. All these things have led a lot of millennials and not just millennials, but a lot of them to question any long-serving, long-standing institution for what its proper social contract is. So I think all organizations are being questioned. We have fake news. We have all this kind of problem going on. I don't know if it's any worse for the nonprofit sector. And I just recently did a study in the United States and looked at kind of trust. And CEOs and directors of nonprofits still remain very high up in terms of trustworthiness, significantly further ahead than many other professionals. So I think it's unfortunate that there is some of this negative news. I guess it's inevitable, and there always will be. So I just hope that donors kind of see beyond that and appreciate it's just a few bad apples, and the rest are very good and trustworthy.
Well, how do you see this drop in trust that has been reported on impacting the sector, and what do you think should be done to regain the trust of the Canadian public?
Yeah, it's a good question, because I'm not 100% sure it's the most strategically important characteristic for us to deal with or to focus on. As I mentioned, I think there's generally still good equity, goodwill within the sector for the sector. I think politicians generally see the sector in a positive way as well. So I don't know if there's much distrust, but of course, any declines in trust, any negative media is not good. There are many more important things that affect giving and volunteering and generosity. Religiosity is a big one. Age, there's a lot of differences in giving and trustworthiness by age. Wealth and income and having disposable income. So I think those are some of the other elements we have to kind of worry about and focus on. With the decline of religiosity, I think it's having a significant negative effect onto the whole sector on generosity, much more than one or two bad apples creating negative news in the media.
So the fact that people are not as church-going as they had been historically, that were in or in churches or other religious groups that would have been more closely associated with charitable works and community service, is that what you're saying?
Yeah. Yes. So clearly, more religious people are more giving. Whether and frankly, any and all religions promote philanthropy and helping others. There's also the other value kind of that if you're in the church, temple, or synagogue every week, then you're getting that reminder. You're seeing the community. You're seeing generous community events every week, all the time. And so it just kind of breeds a mode. It also sets a social norm. Tithing is literally a tenth. I mean, that's what it means. And then religions, many of them preach the necessity to give 10%. If you take that away, and religiosity has been declining in the Western world since World War II, you take away the messaging, you take away the mentoring, you take away the social norm of tithing or whatever it might be, you take away the connections with the community to do good. And unfortunately, in place of that, you get coffee on demand, video on demand, music on demand. It's, I want what I want when I want it. And we are fundamentally changing our social values with respect to giving and volunteering and helping others. And to me, that's almost a big, well, one of the biggest threats to the sector is this decline of the values of being charitable.
Now, Sector 3 Insight also published a report on what Canadians thought about the charitable sector and the government. I was reviewing it in my research for this interview. I wonder if you could share with our audience what it found.
Yeah, we've done a couple of different ones. I was curious, and I've been kind of counseled by past politicians and past prime ministers that everything that you want to achieve in the nonprofit sector needs to be wrapped in good politics. If you need any policy change, it has to make for good politics. Otherwise, it's not likely to happen. So part of good politics is helping, in my view, policymakers understand the merit and how the majority of the electorate feel about something. So we've done a couple of different pieces of research. One was with respect to foundations and the accumulated wealth. Now I think well over $100 billion in investment accounts. And there's not a lot of buzz about that. So what I really want to do is reach out to Canadians, just voters in a sense, across this country, to see if, one, did they understand? Are they aware of what the issues are? Because they could be silent because they don't care, or they could be silent because they're not aware. And what we found out is that a lot of Canadians don't understand how foundations work. Many people within this sector don't understand the difference between a charity versus a foundation, or a private versus a public foundation. So, with that comes, with ignorance comes kind of a lack of action or anything. Once informed, and you ask Canadians and say, well, how do you feel about foundations, for example, having over $80 to $100 billion sitting in their investment assets in perpetuity? Then they say, oh, well, if that's the case, that's not good. And how would you feel about requiring them to give more money sooner to make a charitable difference sooner, right? They all go, well, yes, that's what we want. So the gist of a lot of our research is kind of around these ideas that the electorate really don't follow and aren't aware of the shortcomings. And once they are informed, they are actually quite strong-minded about what they want. And to me, I think that is actually kind of key to policymakers and elected officials, is that they need to appreciate, or to be to their benefit to appreciate, that the electorate actually wants more to be done. And they can do it without a lot of cost to the public purse. So, for example, the disbursement quota, increasing disbursement quota from 3.5% to 5%, basically had zero cost to the public purse. And yet, by our estimates of crunching the CRA numbers, will trigger $1 billion more additionally annually in 1 year, right? That's how quickly that impact is done, right? So it allows the elected officials to say, wow, we could score kudos with the electorate for no cost. How cool is that? That's good politics, right? So I think that's part of the benefit to this, is if we can get politicians to appreciate that there's good politics to be had by addressing and caring a little bit more about the nonprofit sector and its health.
I really want to dive deep into a little bit more about foundations, because I do find them fascinating and quite obscure myself in terms of how they're structured and how they function within society. So I'd love to dig into that a little bit further. But I just wanted to, continue our conversation about public trust, and I guess the understanding of the Canadian public about how the sector can advocate for potential change. We've seen a lot of coming together of the sector during the pandemic, when critical needs were had to be addressed in an emergency, in a crisis. How have you seen the evolution of the capacity for the sector itself to be able to impact policy? And do you think that there has to be changes in the manner in which the sector is able to be heard by Ottawa and have influence over policy that regulates the sector?
Yeah, it's a big question. Lots of different angles to it. I'm not sure where to start. So yes, there have been some advocacy changes. I mean, the disbursement quota, the qualified donee change in regulations there. Those, in my humble opinion, have come from a few individuals pushing hard. So you get Senator Ratna Ahmedbar very much pushing hard for that change in direction and control of qualified donees. Myself and many others, but they were kind of a group of more individuals, I suppose, making noise and bringing to attention of the government the disbursement quota and the need to advocate and to change that. So I think, and maybe this is to the benefit of it, that the sector has a lot of different leadership organizations. It's quite a kind of open source platform, a little bit like Linux for software development, right? It's open source. And there's power in that, because then you can have different people are empowered to put their hand up and say, okay, I want to make a difference and cause change. We don't have a peak organization. There is no one overall thing like the I don't know, the medical association for doctors or the bar for lawyers. There are many different organizations that have leadership type roles, some more kind of sectoral, others more grassroots, something like Canada Helps that represents 20,000 charities, very much grassroots. None of them have a specific mandate to be leadership, and none of them have the governance to be a peak organization. And I'm not sure we need one peak organization. We have them in the provinces. We have Ontario Nonprofit Network and IONS in Nova Scotia, et cetera. But I think it's a combination of all of that allows anyone to come forward and do something. Now, of course, the challenge is collaboration and cooperation. And it's not a natural phenomenon. And it takes a lot of hard work, in part because we're human and humans have their self-interest. And each foundation, each board, each organization has its agenda and its way of being. So to collaborate and to give up with others is not natural. So it's very hard to have collaboration. So I think that's how it is. We kind of, I don't know if stumble is quite the right word, but we all just kind of evolve through with each group trying to do what it can. And then individuals like Senator Ratna Omivar or a little bit of Gibbs 3 and others just kind of pushing a certain agenda item. And I think, to be honest, that's the way it works, right? I know people want to reimagine philanthropy and they want to reinvent the whole nonprofit sector. I just don't think it works that way, right? I mean, no real stable democracy basically accommodates a revolution, right? The revolution is the act of democracy completely failing and falling apart. Otherwise, most stable, safe democracies work by policy change, having elected officials, making good politics, and we just do things incrementally. And I think that's the way we need to do it. We need to be pragmatic. We need to just identify one after another. Okay, increase the disbursement quota, great. Change the direction of control for qualified donees, great. Empower more social innovation, great. And just kind of start knocking these things off. And through a sequence of these things, we'll get to a better place. But to not do that and to say, no, that's not enough. We need to reimagine philanthropy. Almost means that you get into analysis paralysis and you don't change. And nobody has that quick, easy answer for what this new way of philanthropy is going to be. So we need to live within our democratic, pragmatic way of policy making and just fight for individual changes. And the good thing is anybody's allowed to do that.
Well, I appreciate those advocates and champions, really, who make extraordinary change. Gibbs 3, I know, has been very active, and of course, I've spoken to Senator Omivar a number of times about some of the initiatives she's pursued and been very successful in much of her efforts in that way. I guess when you compare it to the for-profit sector or any other industry sector, there's usually some body that represents the interests of that sector who are active in trying to lobby the government and influence policy that has direct impact on how they function. I mean, you could, from the oil and gas industry to telecommunications to virtually the farming sector. That seems to be part of the structure of our democracy. Why is it it's so loose in the nonprofit sector? Is there a need for greater unity or some change in the manner in which we actively try to influence the government?
Is there a need? Yes. Unfortunately, I'm a person who looks at the glass half empty. And as long as charities are struggling and millions of Canadians are suffering, then to me, the glass is always going to be half empty, and that we can never be happy with ourselves while others are suffering. So we need to continue to do better and be different, because our current system is allowing these problems to kind of manifest and continue, right? So not good enough is kind of the way it is. So we need a mechanism to get better. Now, does that come from one peak organization like the Rubber Association or the Steel Industry Association to lobby for their cause? Yeah, maybe, but we have provincial jurisdictions and we have federal jurisdictions, et cetera. So it may be that it needs to be a network of networks or a collaboration of others or something like that. My view on a lot of it is that we don't necessarily lack the imagination, and we certainly are aware of the problems, right? We're all great complainers. People complain, we can complain. We're very good at that. The question is, how do you realize and achieve fruition on the change that you seek? A lot of that is lack of resources. So it's not a lack of thought or people, it's a lack of the resources to do it. So this is why I'm kind of proposing and exploring with other leadership organizations in its kind of infant stage, this idea of a sector fund that creates a levy, creates a fee, creates a membership fee. I'm not sure what you want to call it, but it requires all foundations and charities to donate a certain small fractional percentage of their investment assets into a collective sector fund. And then you would need a new agency, let's call it the sector fund agency, to allocate it in a strategic way, to then bring funds to the imagination, to Imagine Canada's and CFC's and anybody, Carleton, anybody who has initiatives that are strategically valid for the sector, to use those funds to empower them. Right now we lack those resources. So what has happened and has been happening for many years is this call for the government to set up some form of home within government. I think, to be clear, that would never be sufficient to look after the interests of the sectors. Yes, to me, it's obvious that having a government that's more efficient in its administrative role, particularly across ministries and across departments. So if there's a parliamentary secretary responsible for the health of the nonprofit sector, sure, that'd be great. Would they be doing all the things that the sector needs and wants? No. And I kind of note that my first observation for a call for home and government was 1974, right? So do I really think it's going to happen next year? Not really, right? And there have been some successful initiatives in past prior governments, liberal and conservative, where there seems to be collaboration and a step forward, but then the next government of the day comes in and it's all cut. So do I believe and trust and want to give away responsibility for the strength and empowerment of the sector to government and elected officials? Not really. It hasn't happened well to our benefit yet. So I'd rather create this sector fund and sector fund agency independent of government, zero cost to the public purse. We can self-determine from within what is strategically right for our sector and get on with it and stay clear of the political ecosystem. To me, that would be a step in the right direction. Would it be the peak organization? No, I think we still want Community Foundations of Canada and Imagine Canada and United Way and PFC and Volunteer Canada and ONN. We want, they all have roles, so let them do their roles. But yes, we do need more resources. And related to that, I maybe it's not even where your question is going. But you mentioned the nonprofit sector. One of the key things in my mind that works well in the nonprofit sector in the for-profit sector, is that they have a very clean, simple mechanism: profit. And if you don't do well, you go out of business, you go bankrupt, you're gone. And if you do well, it rewards and brings innovation and brings other things. People want to continually innovate and challenge each other and compete. We don't have that in the nonprofit sector. And we don't really have a mechanism for efficiency either. We talk about impact investing, et cetera, but we don't really know what it is. Charities are very poor at measuring these things because they're not researchers and data geeks. They're do-gooders and doctors and whatever. So we don't have any mechanism really for efficiency. And so in default of that, many people in the sector start to focus on process. What's the process for how things are done? Is everybody included? Everybody gets to have their voice said and all those kind of things. And in a sense, then, between this battle between process and purpose, it's almost as if process becomes the purpose, that you have to follow good process. That's more important than anything else, is follow inclusive, proper process. And we've kind of lost the point of all of this, which is to fix the problems, which is the purpose for what we're trying to do. And so I do think that the new leadership and the new people coming in are more entrepreneurial, that they're less focused on process and they're more focused on purpose. And you look at the great for-profit innovators and entrepreneurs, the Bezos and Stephen Jobs of the world, they're not about process. They're just determined to get to an end goal, this new product, this new way of doing things. They break rules. They barge through. Elon Musk doesn't pay respect to any structure or rules. He just does what he wants to do. But boy, he accomplishes things. Love him or hate him, he gets things done, right? And Stephen Jobs got things done, and Bezos got things done. Now, obviously, you could say there's a lot of critical negative parts, but that's what laws are for. And what I mean by that is within the nonprofit sector, we can idolize about not having racism, not having gender inequality, not having homelessness, not having environmental damage, and all these kind of things. But it hasn't happened, right? For 50, 60, 70, 100 years, these problems have lingered, and they are almost as much today. I'm old enough to know all about the Rodney King riots. And then they just got to repeat it all over again with Floyd George. So, wishing and dreaming and idolizing all these newer, better worlds, imagining a better world, is kind of, in a sense, static, and inertia clogs the system. You need to have entrepreneurs who bust through all of that and say, okay, we need systemic change. And the disbursement quota is a prime example. I know Kate Bahane and a group of people tried to get foundations to voluntarily increase their disbursement to 5% during COVID. I think they got less than 100 foundations out of 5,000 who agreed to 5,000 private to do that. I've seen the data for 2020. There was barely an increase. The average of the top 500 private foundations did not get above 5%. So it didn't happen voluntarily. Change policy, new disbursement quota, 5%. In a year and a half from now, we're going to be $1 billion better because of it, right? So to me, that's systemic change, leadership, policy, and how the game needs to be played and fought.
So before we get into the foundations discussion, which again, I'm really interested in, I'd really like to just explore this idea you had about the fund agency, the kind of levy, excuse me, that you're referring to. Is that sort of, do you see this as sort of structured as a committee, or is it obviously across Canada, or how do you imagine this?
Yeah, so working backwards, you start with any strategic plan, you start with the current situation. So one of the problems with the current situation is a huge imbalance of power to foundations with money and those who are organized to influence policy. Who doesn't have a voice are all those who are suffering, the homeless and the dying environment and the abandoned animals, etc. They don't have a voice at the table. So you can sit back and say, okay, we need something that's transparent. We need better governance. We need democracy. We need an organization that's not influenced by its funders. Because if the funders are all of one type, then they are going to influence what that organization does. Right? So the vision was then to create a sector fund that would be mandatory. So again, forget voluntary, because our voluntary actions have got us into the troubles that we're in. We need a systemic solution. So create a fee that would be, and I just kind of focused in on a very small amount, which is a quarter of 1/10 of 1%. It sounds very, very small. And sharing that vision with some foundation people, they said, oh, that's just rounding error. Perfect. It's just rounding error. That's great. But that volume number, a quarter of 1/10 of 1%, on assets of 120 billion in the sector, would generate a fund of $25-30 million annually. So to put that in perspective, I think Imagine Canada's budget's about $5 million. So this would be $30 million. So it suddenly brings resources that the Imagine Canadas of the world don't have. So now you have all of these charities and foundations, and admittedly most of it's foundations, because charities don't have huge investment assets. Their assets are functional for their charitable purpose. So So all these funds are being collected. I would propose it would be a little bit like the tire recycling fee. So we are mandated, if you buy new tires in Canada, you have to pay $5 per new tire. The retailers are mandated to collect it, but the money doesn't go to Ottawa, doesn't go to the Treasury Bureau. It goes to the Rubber Association's tire recycling program because that's a public good, recycling tires. So we have that kind of precedent already that you say, okay, you foundations must pay into this fund, and we'll just ask the CRA to collect it, but then the money goes directly to this new agency. It doesn't go into the Treasury Bureau or the public purse. So you do need a new organization, in my view. Some say, well, why couldn't it be a current organization that already exists? It could, but they would probably need to change their governance so that they are more democratic, transparent, and inclusive, representative of the whole sector. I was thinking that you then have to have a fit-for-purpose sector fund agency who would receive this money. It would have a membership, I would argue, of 25 or 30 member organizations who are already leaders. So each province's nonprofit network would be a member. And then top 7, 8, 9, 10 leadership organizations that you all know, we all know, would be a member. And then these 25, 30, 40 members would have to vote in a board, and the board would have to hire an executive director and get on with creating the strategic plan, et cetera. What I like about that is it's fit for purpose and specific to that without any baggage. If it's to be another organization that's already existing, it would probably have to change its bylaws. It would probably have to vote how its directors are appointed. It would probably have to stop receiving funding from certain sources who would have an undue effect in terms of balance. So you sit back and think, well, maybe it's just easier to start fresh with a brand new one. But that would be the purpose. So it would be receiving these funds to then turn around and allocate them towards a strategic plan. And there's no need to reinvent the wheel. If Carleton is doing great work in research and data collection and hosting a library of best practice, et cetera, imagine what more resources could do. They could expand the sharing of best practices, et cetera. So it would be working with other organizations, but helping with resources. It would have zero cost to the public purse because the money comes from within foundations. It's already money behind the charity tax credit wall that's been taken. So it's basically free to the government. It empowers our sector, gives a voice to our own sector. It won't be vulnerable to the political ecosystem, or less, because once it's up and running, it'd be kind of hard to cut something. And since it has zero cost to the budget, there's no incentive for them to cut it. So that's kind of the innovation that we're trying to work on. That's good politics, right? And then to make a good politics, that we can get a consensus of all the leadership organizations and the nonprofit networks and spokespeople of big foundations to say, yeah, we're not happy about it, but it's a small rounding error. And if that amount of money can count within our new disbursement quota, fine, we have to give it out anyway. So a small little quarter, 0.1% could go to this sector fund. And then rightfully so, several of them said to me, it has to work, right? We don't need another organization. I don't need another newsletter in my inbox. So it has to have positive ROI. It has to do things that aren't getting done now. Well, a few of those things, for example, could be we have declining giving in Canada, right? So we have a void created by the decline of religiosity. Well, we have the President of Participation. It's a promotion, it's marketing to Canadians to exercise, because the more they exercise, then the healthier they are, and then the lower the impact on the Canadian economy for medical, et cetera. So could we have something similar to Donaction, like encouraging Canadians to be caring, caring people help others. Canada's caring nation, so we have to help others, So can we turn around that? And just to put a point on that, had our generation today continue with the same giving practices of our grandparents' generation, which was about 1% of income, we'd be about $2.5 billion more a year in charitable donations. So that's how much we've slipped, because money has gone up because of inflation and we're a bigger country. But we are only giving now about 0.7% of income. We've dropped from 1 to 0.7. That's cost us well over $2.5 billion a year annually. So had we just kept at our grandparents' level, if we could get back to that, to just encouraging generosity, et cetera, it'll have huge returns on investment. But it's not the kind of thing that a home and government would do. They wouldn't set up a promotion campaign and start running these things. I don't think. They haven't yet, So I think we could look after that. The sector fund could look after that. A What Works network like they have in the United Kingdom. There's many precedents of good things elsewhere, but it takes funding, right? So that's the real purpose of the sector fund and the sector fund agency is to collect the funds and not for it to do it all, but to allocate it to those who are capable of doing it.
So the nature of the work that this fund would be funding would be anything to influence or increase charitable giving or the strength of the charities that are in our sector? Like, just what is the nature of the work that they would be funding?
Yeah, I think it has to be strategic for the benefit of the sector as a whole. So if somebody said, well, it should be about inclusion of certain groups, you might say, look, like there's the environment. There's so many different missions that we could worry about. It wouldn't be about any of the missions. It would be above that to say, okay, well, what are the strategic problems facing everybody in the sector? Well, decline of giving. That hurts everybody. And that needs to be turned around. 70 odd plus % of small charities are really lagging in digital empowerment with new tools and just being more effective in achieving more with the same because they're not leveraging digital tools and technologies. Oh, okay. Could we create a program where we have webinars and free courses and maybe even negotiated cheaper software packages as a union of buying to get digital tools into charities? I don't care what your charity is. Everybody's eligible for this. HR programs, retention. Everybody seems to have a retention problem. Everybody seems to have a staffing problem. Again, systemic problem. So we need to be strategic, and I think we just need to pick 3 or 4. We don't solve the world's problems. If we can advance 3 or 4 of those things, this thing that $25 million investment would be paid back in spades, right? I would reserve a little bit for advocacy so that we have somebody who can help achieve other policy changes within government. But a lot of the things I'm talking about really aren't policy changes. Yes, we need to change the Income Tax Act to empower the collection of the sector fund. But once the money is collected and put into the agency and allocated, it's just about doing the things we need to do that we don't have the funds to do.
Well, now I'd like to turn to our discussion about foundations. I know that Sector 3 Insight collaborated on a report that examined the Canadians' understanding and opinion about foundations, and you alluded to it earlier. I'd like to go into the findings in a little bit more detail. I found them quite fascinating and really not surprising given, I guess, the opaqueness with which the foundations appear to the average person. Can you tell us what that report revealed?
Yeah, well, Canadians aren't aware of how foundations accumulate wealth and probably don't appreciate that it's money out of the public purse, right, by the way of charity tax credits given to donors. So in a sense, 50 cents on every dollar is taxpayers' money being given back to the donor. So Canadians, taxpayers, have a right to say how and what's going on there, and yet they're totally unaware of what's going on there. The Income Tax Act allowed for and actually created this need for the disbursement quota to specifically enforce charitable behavior in a timely manner. And to not have a disbursement quota would allow money to sit in perpetuity and collect. And it was actually described in the white paper as being an indirect tax on Canadians because it takes money out of the public purse and yet it doesn't come back to them. And it was originally 5%. And through an imbalance of power, politicians got lobbied to reduce it to 4.5%, and that happened. Then they got lobbied again to reduce it to 3.5%, and that happened. Never changed in the United States, by the way. It's always been 5%. So we had an imbalance of power that changed the nature of what the intention was, which was that we want foundations to exist. We want the charitable sector to exist because it has benefits for existing, which I totally agree with. But it needs to act in a charitable manner, in a timely manner. And that's where it got off the rails, because we started to allow the accumulation of assets sitting on the sidelines in perpetuity. And clearly in my mind, delayed good is less good. Holding money back to solve a problem 30, 40, 50, or 100 years from now, when everybody dies in the process, the environment tanks out, species are lost, etc. But they say, no worries, we got money for 100 years from now. And you go, yeah, well, you can't bring back all those things. And if you can solve cancer in the next 5 years, why hold back funding for 50 years from now? So to me, it just seemed that we needed to honor the intention of the Income Tax Act, to treat taxpayers fairly, to return their lost taxpayer money from the public purse back to their benefit in their own lifetime, and to take money from one generation to use to the benefit of another 50 years from now. They're not even born yet. It wasn't fair to anybody, and particularly those who are suffering and struggling. And people say, well, there won't be any charity, or there may not be any charity in the future. Well, one, I find that hard to believe, because there's always new entrepreneurs, and most of the philanthropists we talk about today are alive and made their money all within the last 20 years, right? It's not the Carnegies and the Rockefellers and the Fords that we hear about. It's all these live guys are making wealth in their current lifetime and sharing it in their current lifetime. But more than that is, if there aren't philanthropists 50 years or 75 years or 100 years from now, then that's that generation's, that society's shortcoming. That's their problem. But you can't penalize suffering Canadians and willing taxpayers today, because there may not be a philanthropist 75 or 100 years from now. So when I found out myself, I wasn't even aware that foundations were accumulating billions, tens of billions, now over $100 billion. It just felt wrong. It just wasn't right. And I was wondering why nobody was saying anything. And it was because, so we did the research, just because nobody was aware of it. And then once you point out to people, then they get mad, they get upset, and they say, well, that's not right. And so politicians aren't hearing about it because nobody's aware of it. Once you point it out to them, you can then take the research and go to the policymakers and say, look, 75% of Canadians want this changed. And it costs you nothing, and you'll get all the kudos for it. And to that point, we even put a question in about voter intention. Which Canadian party are you likely to vote for? So that we can then break out the research results by those intending to vote NDP, Liberal, or Conservative, to show them how their voters felt about this. Because again, that's the only way this game works, right, is politics and good politics. So when you go to them and say, look, the majority of your voters want this to happen, and it costs you nothing, and you can look good doing it. And for all the demands on the sector, the disbursement quotas was one of the very few things that got into the budget, because it made for very good politics.
Now, the other aspect of this, I guess, is, I mean, when you break it down from a technical point of view, these private foundations are essentially taking donations. They are able to, I guess, hold them and build capital, and then only are required to disperse this very small amount for the actual charitable good, and that they're supposed to be in support of, and then simultaneously building up that capital over time, because they're not required to disperse it, or at least not in large amounts. And that's part of the issue, correct? And I mean, these are very sophisticated entities. I'm assuming that, there could be lease structures back and forth between the foundations and the charity, and I just, it just seems almost opaque for a reason, where there's a lot of wealth that's being built up within these foundations that are tax-free while they're within the foundation. Is that correct?
Yeah, it is. There's no income tax. There's no capital gains tax. There's no taxes at all on what they're doing. If you look at the financial performance, and it's kind of awkward that we're talking now because the markets have done really well, but if you look at in the last 15 years, when these foundations amassed all of this huge potential, if you weren't earning way over 10% in real growth with very, very low inflation, then you had something wrong with your money managers and your investment committee has to do, has to really question, like, why isn't it that we can't make 10% with these financial markets? So then why is it that during that same time, their disbursements actually decreased as percent of assets? And it has. Not only has their wealth gone up, but percentage of their wealth that they're giving away has been going down during this boom cycle. And our need is there. We have a growing charity need because we have a growing population. We have immigrants, and right now we have recession, et cetera, or inflation, that we have this huge growing charity gap. And yet these guys have voluntarily chosen to amass wealth. And I do know some stepped up in COVID until 2020. Others closed, literally saying, as of now, for the rest of the year, no more grant requests because we can't give more because we needed the capital. And he's like, okay, so you're prioritizing preservation of capital ahead of being charitable. And, some people say that it's important to have this piggy bank for a rainy day when the roof leaks. If there's ever a year, 2020 was that rainy day and that leaky roof. And very few stepped up. And if you look at the end of the year 2020, the sector asset grew, the asset base grew, and the dispersion of the top 500 private foundations in 2020 was lower than it was in 2018 before COVID. They did not step up. They chose to bank asset growth. So we can wish, we can holler, we can complain, we can do whatever we want. It doesn't change until you have a system change, a law. Disbursement quota is now 5%. I think it should be a little bit higher. Some have voluntarily, the Ivey Foundation is a great example of somebody who said, there's a crisis going on and we need to solve it now. So all gunpowder in, all fireworks go, and we're going to put ourselves out of business in 5 years. One of the Bronfman Foundations, we're just going to spend it all and go. Bill Gates says, I'm going to spend all this in my lifetime. So this idea of keeping things in perpetuity, it's got to do something about ego and self-centeredness and other, I don't know what their motivations are, but I would suggest that it's more than just being charitable. And that's a problem. It's not fair to taxpayers and struggling charities and the millions of Canadians in need.
So now that we've recognized the problem, what do we do next? Do you spread the word? Well, how are you attacking this scenario, if you are? And what obviously it's a higher disbursement you'd be in favor of. The other thing would be, of course, I guess, more scrutiny or regulation or more rules around, how long you can hold the funds. What would you suggest?
Yeah, well, I don't want to lose the baby in the bathwater as the bathtub empties, right? So we still want foundations. So if somebody really wants to have their name on a foundation in perpetuity for the benefits they believe that brings, we should create a new class of foundations, what I'll call non-issuing foundations. So these are foundations that you do not get a charity tax credit for putting your money in. So if you don't take money out of the public purse, then the public doesn't have a right to tell you how to do it. So then the disbursement quota wouldn't apply. So then their funds could grow in perpetuity. I would say all other rules have to apply, that you can't disperse it on on private benefit or on families. Once it's in, all the other rules of charities and foundations apply. But the disbursement quota wouldn't apply because you didn't take a charity tax credit. So that's just a policy thing. And again, costs nothing to the government to do that. So I do want to protect the people who want to have that. I still want people giving money into the sector. Other things that need to be done, I think donor advised funds, which is a growing area of the philanthropic circle of wealth. So donor advised funds, as you know, are these organizations that have individual accounts where I could hypothetically give $100,000. I get a tax credit immediately back from that institution. My amount is kept in my own name in a little account, like a brokerage account, but it's a donation account. And it's in there, and then I can just call them up and say, can you please send $1,000 here or $500 there? I got my upfront tax credit immediately. The money in my account, the disbursement quota doesn't apply to it directly. I could do zero. And so I've taken the money from the public purse for my charity tax credits, but I'm actually not obliged to donate that money. As long as all the accounts in summary for that institution gets to that 5% level, then that overall institution is on side. Right? And inevitably there will be some foundation DAF accounts that will pay 100% of their money out. They'll just say, okay, I'm dying, give it all to McGill. They give it all away. So as long as there are some accounts that are giving 100% distribution, then it allows many others to give 0% of distribution, even though I took my personal charity tax credit. Right? So again, that's a little bit immoral and a little bit wrong. So what they should be doing is saying, okay, this 5% applies to each DAF account. Each account holder must disperse 5%. And just because somebody else gave away 100% doesn't mean John Hallward gets a free ride. And this, they got kind of pushback as, oh, that's a lot of paperwork, etc. Well, look at retail brokerage. They have paperwork. They have individual accounts. They have performance of your account, 3 months, 6 months, 9 months, 12. They have the software and the infrastructure to do account management. It's not hard for a donor advised fund organization to check if each donor account is dispersing 5%. The Income Tax Act and the law doesn't apply to that, but that's an easy, quick fix that could. Another crazy idea, but again, it costs not much to the government. But, for all of our money that we could give to any charity, we all get the same charity tax credit. It doesn't matter which charity we give to it. As long as it's a registered charity, we get a charity tax credit. But clearly not all missions are equal to society. We all feel, on our research, we've asked Canadians, do you feel, and we have to have them rank the importance of different charitable missions in terms of most important to their community. And there clearly are some missions that are more important than other missions. But $200 donation to any one of them is exactly the same. That's just not how the electorate wants it. It's just not how it is. So we should have a tiered system. Certain missions are more important and you get a bigger charity tax credit. Others are less important, you get a lower charity tax credit. And that's not a crazy idea because we already have a two-tiered system in Canada that if I give $200 to a political party, I get a higher charity tax credit for the $200 to a political party than if I donated the same $200 to a battered wife shelter, a homeless shelter, a food bank, right? So we already have a two-tiered system. Unfortunately, the only ones in the top tier are our political national parties. So just add one or two more, let's say, mental health, food bank, and something else, and get the same incentive as that. It's not, right? It's not a big issue, but it needs to be lobbied for, and we need to wrap it in good politics, and we need to show them that the electorate will support that, and that you will, whichever political party implements that policy is going to get the kudos of the electorate. So these are the things we need to start lobbying for and advocating for.
Well, I'm all for a strong democracy, but that makes no sense to me, to be honest. What an example. It tells the whole story. I would really love, as just we wrap up, if you had any other, thoughts that you want to leave with our audience for people to really think about as they sort of look at the big picture of, how the deficit in giving within the sector as well as the whole kind of murky structure and lack of strong regulation around the foundations. I would really love to hear any kind of words you want to leave with our audience.
Yeah, I think to me, there's this concept of the innocent bystander effect, which is that if there's a bunch of people standing around, I don't know, somebody who got hit by a taxi, the psychological kind of effect is that it's diluted responsibility, that nobody else is rushing forward, and so we tend not to. Once you're trained about that, once you're kind of been informed and you learn what is this bystander effect, you're much more likely to act. You're much more likely to then say, oh, this is the bystander effect. I need to move forward and help this person, right? And you bust through that psychological problem. I think we have the same problem in the nonprofit sector, which is so many people are focused on, as I mentioned earlier, on process instead of purpose. And we need people to start focusing on and acting entrepreneurial. When people say, oh, that's a complicated problem, that's a sign of bureaucracy and defensiveness. simplify it, make it simple. Don't hide behind complexity. So we need to just recognize this bystander effect and kind of say, okay, everybody in the sector, or anybody in the sector who can start to put purpose ahead of process will start to get towards innovation and change and focus more on the outcome and less on how we get there. So the ends justify the means. And I guess related, I would say too, I'd like politicians to understand the electoral effect. We can complain about no home in government. We can complain about the sector represents 8% of GDP and hires 2 million Canadians. I think they know all that. I think they've heard that for the last 30 years. I think what they need to understand is there's votes for you. It doesn't have to cost them money. You can really throw a bone to the sector, empower the sector without it costing the public purse a lot.
Well, John, it's just been fascinating speaking with you on these really critical issues at a time when, so much more is needed as the nonprofit sector emerges from the pandemic. I'm really looking forward to learning more about your work at Give3 and Sector 3 Insights. Thank you for joining CharityVillage Connects.
My pleasure, Marion. Thank you for the opportunity. Hopefully there's some more like-minded people. I'd love to hear from them. Thank you.